The lovely sounds of the pond there interrupted by the harsh call of the bullfrog. What better way to introduce the GCSE poetry anthology poem Death of a Naturalist by Seamus Heaney. As normal, we'll explore the meaning of the poem then, that is the grid on the left, the context of the poem, which is the grid on the right, and the language and structure of the poem and the effects that are then created, which is the column or the box in the centre of the screen. Seamus Heaney is probably one of our better known poets. He is one of the most respected poets of his generation. His work encapsulates the Industrial Revolution as he covers topics such as memory, countryside, and Ireland's musical heritage, and combines them with a historical edge. Links to the Northern Irish Troubles can frequently be found, and as a consequence, his work often has many layers of meaning. His fellow Catholics were at first critical of his unwillingness to take a side against the Protestants, yet they have been slowly won over by the work of the lyrical beauty and depth of his work. He felt he was caught between being brought up as a farmer and being educated at school. Simply put, the beautiful countryside and clear religion that his father had enjoyed was disappearing, and being replaced by school and religious fighting when Heaney grew up. I'm now going to play an interview with Heaney himself as he explores some of the things that inspired his work and his own family background.
Heaney was born in 1939 into a Catholic family in Northern Ireland and grew up on a farm in County Derry. He's now moved to the south and lives with his family in Dublin. Seamus Heaney, those early beginnings, what sort of farm was it?
Well, it's what they call a small farm, but of course one man's small farm is another man's estate. And this was actually about 50 acres. I say it was, the land is still the same, but things have changed on the land. I mean, when I was growing up in the 40s, you could still see people ploughing with horses, you could still see people mowing with scythes, you could still see people using forks to build hay. And the rhythm of life was really a medieval rhythm almost, you know. When the 50s, with mechanisation and so on, that all changed. And now the same land, same ground, but there are milking parlours and tractors and mechanisations, and the rhythms have changed considerably.
But all those old rhythms and the, I mean, for example, there are that you've got poems about Thatchers, blacksmiths,
yeah, right.
The forges,
yeah.
And all those things. They are from your very early days.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when I began to write, for some reason or other, it was that first deposit of experience that was almost hermetically sealed, sealed down, came up, and it was like reaching into another world, even though it was a world that I had experienced, say, 15, 20 years before.
Now, your father keeps coming back in these, images of your father at work, and indeed sometimes of your grandfather as well, and potatoes, digging and things like that.
Well, I think that is part of my generation's experience in this way, that I was part of the 1947 Education Act transition from land to school, as it were, from the earth of labour to the heaven of education.
The heaven of education. As you can see, Heaney speaks passionately about the world he knew 15, 20 years ago, compared with the world that we're now living in. Here is the poem then, Death of a Naturalist by Seamus Heaney, read in this case by Seamus himself.
Death of a Naturalist. All year the flaxdown festered in the heart of the townland. Green and heavy-headed, flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. Daily it sweltered in the punishing sun. Bubbles gargled delicately. Blue bottles wove a strong gauze of sound around the smell. There were dragonflies, spotted butterflies, but best of all were the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shade of the banks. Here, every spring, I would fill jampotfuls of the jellied specks. to range on windowsills at home, on shelves at school, and wait and watch until the fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. Miss Walsh would tell me how the daddy frog was called the bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. You could tell the weather by frogs too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in rain. Then one hot day, when fields were rank with cowdog in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flaxdown. I ducked through hedges to a coarse croaking that I hadn't heard before. The air was thick with a bass chorus. Right down the dam, gross-bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. Some hopped, the slap and plop were obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned, and ran. The great slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it.
Now let's look at detail then at some of the language choices and effects that are created. We're going to look at the beginning of the poem, then the middle of the poem, then the end of the poem. So each of the notes here would become one paragraph or so of your response in the exam. The notes you're going to see are almost far too much to write about, but they give a good understanding of perhaps the quotes you might want to choose to unpick in more detail. The structure ones are going to be in green. The language choice ones, the ones focusing on language choices, are going to be in white. Let's start with the title then. A naturalist is a scientist who studies the natural world. When the poem begins, the young Heaney is a budding naturalist. He is looking forward to exploring nature. Yet, by the end of the poem, his fascination with nature has ended, or died, hence the death of a naturalist in the title. Many of the readers might look at the title as deliberately exaggerated. Heaney didn't actually die, but certainly his love for nature faded. The poem is written in blank verse, using iambic pentameter, in a fairly loose way. The poem is structured into two sections, one expressing excitement and exuberance, and the other repulsion, as Heaney begins to think about exactly where his hand is in that pond, and the disgusting frogs that seem to be clustered around him. All year the flaxdown festered in the heart. Heaney echoes the death in the title with the words fested and rotted in the opening sentence. Additionally, the flax is disturbingly personified, with heavy-headed and weighed down. Flax is a long kind of grass that you find near the edges of ponds, and you can see here that it's bowed down as if it's suffering under the weight. Later in the first stanza, Heaney uses many images which appeal to different senses. Bubbles gargled, blue bottles wove strong gauze of sound through the smell, dragonflies and spotted butterflies, slobber of frog spawn, clotted water, all suggest breathless enthusiasm. He's amazed at what nature is showing him. The young Heaney, the young speaker, revels in nature in all its forms, and that's why we have this quite long list of the different aspects of nature he can see. There are two particular animals mentioned here. We've got the dragonfly and the butterfly. Both of them are symbolic, as they both change in a chrysalis from an ugly creature into a beautiful one. The poem itself is similar, as Heaney changes from a naturalist to someone who fears nature. The middle of the poem. In the shade of the branks, here every spring. The spring could represent a new start or a new chapter in Heaney's life. It is symbolic, then, of the man he used to be, or the boy he used to be, compared with the boy he grows into through the course of the poem. Heaney uses traditional childish games to show how simple life is, and exaggerate the joy of childhood. In this case, the reference to the jam pot films of jellied specks. He's enjoying gathering the frog spawn, as you can see in the background, into jam pots, a very traditional hobby for a boy perhaps of 8 or 9 years old. The setting then changes from the pond itself to the school. We've got this reference to shelves at school and wait and watch. This deliberately sounds sinister and eerie to foreshadow the fear that builds as the poem grows. This very static image of school, this very cold image of school, is left behind as Heaney travels back to nature and begins to learn a more scientific approach about it. Heaney uses the phrase mammy frog and daddy frog. This is deliberately childlike. This reminds us of the young age of the narrator and how innocent and inexperienced he actually is. We then have a visual break between sections 1 and 2 of the poem. This enhances the break between the boyish glee that he felt as a child and the fear he has as he grows into an adolescent. Now we're going to move on then to the end of the poem. There is a change of time here, as if the boy has realised how bad nature can be as the stink and decay slowly increases over time. We can really picture the situation here as he describes then one hot day. On hot days, obviously nature and the mud slowly increases in temperature and the smell gets much more pungent. He describes these frogs as being angry, personifying them. Perhaps they hate the fact that Heaney came along as a boy and stole the children, the tadpoles in this case. The arrival of the frogs is like a military invasion. They are angry and invade the dam. The boy ducks through hedges to hide from the enemy. Like firearms, they are cocked or they are poised like mud grenades. A grenade is a hand bomb. The frogs, in colour and shape, resemble the Mills hand bomb used by the British soldiers in the Great War in modern times. Later in the stanza, the words become increasingly repulsive. Slap, plop, gross, mud, farting. These are all onomatopoeic or sound words. At the end of the stanza, we have this image of nightmarish fantasy. The spawn may enact revenge for his earlier theft if he plunges his hand into the pond. This reminds us of a comic book or B-Boo movie monster, as well as drawing upon the similar way that love of nature slowly changed into fear in The Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. To summarise then, Death of a Naturalist by Seamus Heaney. Who is it about? Well, it's Seamus Heaney goes pond dipping in Ireland as a small boy. What is it about? It's about a young child who's at first mesmerised by nature and then begins to fear it. Nature begins to get revenge after he takes some frog spawn. Why was it written? Heaney explores the effect of education and the changes in religion on him when he was young. His love of the natural world disappeared. We're now going to look at some key quotes from the poem. Please feel free to pause the video so you can make notes on these key quotes. It'd be a really good idea to practice writing these up as paragraphs as well, because that will help you remember it. There we have then quote number 1. And quote number 2. And quote number 3. Today then, when we look at the essay practice section of this video, we're going to focus on a comparison question. How does Dulce Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen and one other poem of your choice, in this case Death of a Naturalist, explore the theme of war? Now obviously in this poem we're not talking about war between men, we're talking about a man versus nature, which is why it makes it quite an interesting poem to look at. Heaney is at war with the frogs. The word explore is interesting there. The examiner is looking for more than one answer. They want you to look at alternatives. To what extent, then, is the poem about war? How is this theme carried through the poem? How is it built from stanza 1 to stanza 2, or in Dulce Decorum Est's case, stanza 1 to think it's about number 4? The examiner wants us to look at the different meanings behind the word choices and the structural choices within the poem. Here is the marking criteria in full then, not the shortened version you normally see in these videos. You'll notice it is marked up to 25 here, and you have these parts here which ask you questions or comment on the comparisons. For a bottom grade, it says comparison is very limited. For about a grade 3, we'd expect comparison to be general with some discussion with obvious similarities and differences explained. For a grade 4 to 5, we have comparison focused across the language, the structure, as well as the context, with a mini discussion perhaps of the similarities and or differences between the poems. For the higher grades, that is grades 6 and 7, we'd expect quite a lot of comparison sustained across the language, the meaning, and the context. And the candidate, or the person being examined, will clearly discuss the similarities and differences between the poems. For the highest grade, which is your grade 8 and 9s, comparison is critical, illuminating and sustained across all the 3 focus areas. There'll be a wide-ranging discussion of similarities and differences. So you might expect a grade 8 or 9 candidate to look at the history of the poets and compare those, comparing how war, in this case, is shown through the language of the poem, and comparing how they both use violent imagery to perhaps represent the war that's taking place. This then is our opening paragraph to our essay, exploring the theme of war through Dulce Decorum Est and Death of a Naturalist. We should be thinking then to show the following. How does this introduction show secure understanding? What evidence is there that I have in fact compared the poems? And here is my response. It's short, it's about 3 sentences long, and should only take 2 or 3 minutes to write. Wilfred Owen deliberately explores the theme of war in response to the propaganda of the time. He reveals the reality of the First World War rather than the lies the government tell. On the other hand, Heaney deliberately uses a pond setting to suggest that man is at war with nature. Notice the comparison connective on the other hand. There's a bit more detail on Dulce Decorum Est, but the comparison is clearly there. I show that I'm answering the question by mentioning the word war and mentioning the word explores to make those links then, knowing then I'm going to keep my answer focused on what I'm being set in the test. Once again, short introduction, 3 sentences long, with a brief bit of context, in this case the reference to the First World War, being mentioned. Onward then to what become paragraph 2. You can see it's quite a lot longer, it's filled with quotes all the way through, and I begin to look in much more detail at what's actually happening within both poems. From the outset, Owen deliberately uses similes, such as like old beggars and coughing like hags. They compare the soldiers, who are young men, to older, weaker people. Beggars and hags are also unpleasant nouns, which makes the reader feel disgust at the shape the soldiers are in. Owen uses these similes in his opening lines to create a strong, repulsive image of what war has done to these men. This is because back home propaganda posters made war look glamorous, and Owen wanted people to know the truth. In the quote, haunting flares, personification is used to suggest to the reader the fear and terror the soldiers lived with. Flares were a sign of help being needed, but here the soldiers walking away from them, as if they've given up hope. On the other hand, Heaney begins with, all year the flaxdown festered, green and heavy flax had rotted there. Although the majority of the opening stanza to this poem is filled with childish glee and adventure, the use of festered and rotted in the opening lines help foreshadow the shift in tone later on. The lexical set of menacing words sound dangerous and horrifying, as if war and danger are always just under the surface. The phrase green and heavy begins to suggest how man's interference with nature is beginning to have an impact on its beauty. You'll notice in this paragraph, I've deliberately focused just on the beginning of each poem. There are lots of quotes there that you could easily highlight, and there is a clear comparison. On the other hand, when writing my main paragraph, because this is where most of the grade would come from, I should be asking, how many quotes do I need to use? What evidence is there of analysis? And how has context been used? As well as what links can you find to the structure of the two poems? If I write an example answer, those are the kind of things I'd now check my work for. So I'd highlight like old beggars, coughing like hags, beggars, hags, all year the flax down festered, haunting flares, fested, rotted, green and heavy as being my quotes. They're all embedded, which means they're all part of other sentences, and they all link together as Heaney and Owen slowly explore the theme of war. How do I know I've analysed? Well, analysing is when you look at particular parts of a quote. You zoom in on particular details. So, for example, I've looked at like old beggars in the second line of my response. Then I've looked at particular words from them, beggars and then the hags, and explained why those words might be used, in this case saying that the reader should feel deliberate disgust at these particular images. That shows then I'm analysing a quote, I'm picking it apart and looking at details. The next question is context. How can I tell that I know the context of the poem? Well, there's a reference to what flares are, and there's also a reference here to the fear and terror the soldiers lived with, implying then that I understand what the First World War was like. I then go on to the use of a flare here, and then how that actually fits in the poem. This idea of the soldiers walking away from these flares. I've mentioned the fact for Death of a Naturalist that the poet is a child with his childish glee. And then I pick apart the words festered and rotted, again linking back to my analysis. At the moment, there isn't much context in here, but I don't want it to become a historical essay. I don't want to overcram it full of my contextual knowledge. Knowing 3 or 4 things about each poem's context is enough to succeed at GCSE level. What links can I find to the structure of the poems? Now that's where effects are built up or the different sentences might be used. So the most obvious example of this is where I talk about a lexical set or group of similar words, in this case menacing words. And I think, okay, the meaning is being shaped through different word choices that are found throughout the stanza, not just in one line. Let's move on then to paragraph 3, focusing on the middle of the poem. You can see straight away from my opening couple of words that I'm focusing on structure, as Owen's poem develops, implying then this is not a separate poem, it's simply adding to what's already gone before. As Owen's poem develops, the slow pace is interrupted by gas, gas, quick boys. The use of the exclamation, notice how I've looked here at a particular kind of punctuation. That's detailed analysis. The use of exclamation dramatically changes the rhythm of the poem, helping the reader understand the sheer panic the soldiers were experiencing. These words be amongst the worst a soldier in World War I, linked to context, could hear. Victims of gas attacks died long, painful deaths, which there was no cure. He plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. The use of strong verbs here help us understand the awful desperation of the situation. The man is helpless, nothing can be done for him. Guttering and choking are onomatopoeic, creating sounds that would be heard in this case, a war zone. By repeating drowning, again, linking to the structure there, words that are repeated throughout the poem, by repeating drowning a second time, the rhyme scheme is also disrupted, helping the reader focus on the horrible nature of the man's death. This is a painful and personal recollection of Wilfred Owen, the image of one man who did not manage to put on his mask in time. In all my dreams suggests that regularly had nightmares about this, and before my helpless sight demonstrates how powerless he or anyone else was to be able to do anything to help. Instead, they simply had to watch their friends die. Heaney also pivots his poem around a central line, showing there a clear connection between the two with the word also. Heaney also pivots his poem around a central line, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in the rain. Yellow, as I now begin to analyse the line, is a warm colour, often connoting happiness, in this case the innocence of childhood, with brown appearing much dirtier, representing that innocence has been tainted by knowledge, and the lovely land is beginning to tear itself apart due to the religious conflict at the time, and man's education about nature. Heaney saw the change in man's reaction to nature, and he was at school while previous generations would have learnt about nature through the working with the land. Here I could ask the same questions I did before, and I would highlight this answer to check that I've fulfilled everything the exam board want. I would suggest, for the last paragraph, the fourth one, the end of the poem, please look at the notes back earlier in this video and think about creating your own response, asking the same questions as I did with my answer just now. This should take you about 10 minutes to write, but obviously the first time around when you're first writing it might take a bit longer than that. Thank you then for listening to this video or watching this video on Seamus Heaney's Death of a Naturalist.